Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast. The Origins of Architecture, Chapter 7, Monumentality and Belief. In the previous chapter, we explored how the emergence of public space transformed architecture from domestic enclosure into a framework for collective interaction, gathering, and social organization. We examined how settlements gradually developed communal environments that supported cooperation, ritual, and shared identity. In this chapter, we move from gathering to belief itself. The discussion shifts from collective interaction to symbolic permanence, from public presence to ritual meaning, and from shared environments to the emergence of monumentality. Monumentality is often associated with scale. Large temples, massive structures, and imposing forms are typically understood as the defining characteristics of monumental architecture. Yet monumentality is not simply a question of physical size. At its core, monumentality concerns the human desire to stabilize meaning through architecture. A monument attempts to transform belief, memory, authority, or collective identity into spatial permanence. This transformation marks one of the most profound shifts in early architectural history. Earlier settlements primarily organized survival, continuity, and everyday life. Monumental environments, however, introduced architecture operating beyond immediate practicality. Space increasingly became symbolic. Structures no longer existed only to protect bodies or organize routines, but also to represent invisible ideas materially. The emergence of ritual played a central role in this transformation. Human communities had long engaged in symbolic behavior, ceremony, burial practices, and collective gathering. However, once settlements became increasingly permanent and socially organized, ritual itself began acquiring architectural form. Certain spaces became repeatedly associated with ceremony, seasonal cycles, spiritual activity, and collective memory. Repetition gradually stabilized symbolic space. This stabilization transformed architecture fundamentally. Ritual environments were not experienced merely as functional locations, but as spaces carrying emotional, symbolic, and cultural significance. Architecture therefore began mediating relationships not only between humans and the environment, but also between humans and meaning itself. At this stage, monumentality should not be understood exclusively in terms of later urban civilizations or imperial architecture. Some of the earliest monumental environments emerged long before cities, states, or formal political systems fully developed. What matters is not only scale, but intentional symbolic concentration. Communities began directing labor, resources, and collective attention towards spaces whose significance exceeded immediate survival needs. This reveals something deeply important about the origins of architecture. Monumental construction demonstrates that humans were willing to invest enormous collective effort into symbolic environments. Architecture was becoming capable of spatially expressing shared beliefs. The built environment therefore evolved into a medium through which societies externalized cultural imagination itself. The relationship between monumentality and collective labor is particularly significant. Monumental construction often requires coordination extending beyond individual households or small family groups. Quarrying, transportation, material preparation, spatial organization, and construction all demand forms of collective cooperation. Monumentality therefore reflects not only symbolic intention, but also social organization at increasingly complex scales. Architecture here becomes evidence of coordinated society itself. The ability to produce large ritual environments suggests communities capable of long-term planning, labor distribution, and shared symbolic motivation. Monumentality therefore emerges simultaneously as architectural, social, and cultural achievement. At the same time, monumentality also transforms the relationship between architecture and time. Domestic structures support everyday continuity, but monuments attempt to resist time itself. Ritual architecture often seeks permanence because it carries meanings intended to endure beyond individual lifespans. Construction becomes connected to memory, ancestry, continuity, and collective historical presence. This desire for permanence contributes directly to the symbolic power of architectural materials. Stone in particular gradually acquires monumental significance because of its durability and visual stability. Monumental environments therefore often emphasize material endurance alongside symbolic meaning. Architecture is increasingly associated not only with habitation but also with cultural persistence across generations. The emergence of monumentality also psychologically transforms spatial experience. Monumental environments frequently produce awe, orientation, reverence, or collective focus through scale, repetition, enclosure, elevation, or spatial sequencing. Architecture begins shaping emotional experience deliberately rather than incidentally. Space becomes capable of symbolically influencing perception. This symbolic dimension changes how humans position themselves within the environment. Earlier settlements primarily organized practical relationships between body, shelter, labor, and survival. Monumental architecture, however, situates humans within larger symbolic systems, including cosmology, ritual order, ancestry, spirituality, and collective identity. Architecture therefore begins mediating existential relationships as well as practical ones. The connection between monumentality and visibility is equally important. Monumental structures often function as spatial markers visible across landscapes, reinforcing collective orientation and symbolic presence. Architecture increasingly operates at territorial and cultural scales extending beyond immediate domestic life. Settlements begin identifying themselves through shared symbolic environments. At the same time, monumentality should not be interpreted only as a spiritual expression. Monumental environments also participate in the emergence of authority and social hierarchy. The organization of ritual often concentrates symbolic power within particular individuals, groups, or institutions. Architecture therefore begins mediating relationships between belief and control more visibly. Yet reducing monumentality entirely to domination would oversimplify its complexity. Monumental spaces also generate collective cohesion, shared identity, emotional continuity, and communal participation. They allow societies to experience themselves symbolically as unified groups. Architecture therefore becomes capable of producing collective emotional experience at unprecedented scales. This transformation also marks a critical moment in the relationship between architecture and abstraction. Domestic environments primarily respond to immediate bodily needs, whereas monumental architecture increasingly represents ideas that cannot be directly touched or physically measured. Belief, memory, sacredness, ancestry, and cosmology all require symbolic translation into spatial form. Architecture therefore becomes increasingly conceptual. The emergence of monumentality additionally transforms architectural perception itself. Buildings are no longer evaluated solely through utility or environmental responsiveness, but also through meaning, symbolism, and representation. Architecture begins communicating culturally. Space acquires interpretive depth because structures now embody narratives extending beyond practical occupation. This symbolic depth contributes directly to the later development of religious, political, and civic architecture throughout human history. Monumentality establishes the idea that architecture can materially embody collective values. The built environment becomes capable of representing systems of thought rather than merely supporting biological survival. At the same time, early monumental environments remain deeply connected to landscape and environmental conditions. Ritual structures often aligned with topography, celestial observation, seasonal cycles, or environmental orientation. Monumentality therefore did not emerge outside nature, but through intensified symbolic relationships with it. Architecture remained simultaneously embedded in ecological and cosmological awareness. Monumentality and belief ultimately reveal that architecture had expanded far beyond shelter, settlement, or domestic continuity. Architecture was becoming a symbolic language through which societies materially represented collective imagination. Space is no longer organized only for survival or social interaction. It is increasingly organized for meaning itself. In the next chapter, we will move from monumentality to the emergence of proto-urban thinking. We will examine how increasingly complex settlements gradually developed interconnected systems of circulation, organization, density, and collective coordination that anticipated later urban environments. The discussion will shift from symbolic centers to spatial networks, from ritual permanence to settlement complexity, and from monumental gathering to the earliest concepts of the proto-city. Because once architecture became capable of organizing belief collectively, the next transformation became inevitable, organizing entire settlements as integrated systems of life. This concludes Chapter 7 of The Origins of Architecture, Monumentality and Belief. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.